Welcome to Sunday Sermons, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Exodus, chapter 15, verses 22 through 27, and chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. And I'll read the first 3 verses for us now as we prepare to hear from lead pastor Travis Simone as he helps us continue in our sermon series titled, The Exodus Way. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?"
Last night, I did a wedding for my dad because he had this wedding on the books and he did not want to disappoint this couple. And it just so happened that I actually went to elementary school with the bride. And so I stepped in and performed the wedding for my dad last night. And right after the ceremony, it was the time when the family was taking pictures. And as the pastor, sometimes the bride and groom want a picture with you, sometimes they don't. So I'm kind of waiting to see what they want. And I'm talking with one of the brothers-in-law who was desperate to see if we were going to get inside the restaurant by 6:30 because that's when the UVA football game started. It's like, "Pastor, what do you think? How long do these pictures take?" And as I'm talking to the brother-in-law, his son, Ben, came up to him and in the sweetest voice said, "Dad, are you mad at me?" The dad said, "What? Why would I be mad at you?" The kid said, "Well, Dad, I spent $75 on video game credits this afternoon. I just didn't want you to be mad at me." And I looked at the kid, I said, "Kid, did you just confess to your dad a $75 video game expenditure right as he is experiencing the joy of his sister-in-law getting married, right as he's standing next to and speaking with a pastor? Well played, son. Well played." You see, human beings will do almost anything to avoid pain. Human beings will do almost anything to avoid discipline and having to face the deficiencies of our character. And that kid, his name was Ben, by the way, put on a master class. See, last week we learned that God's road out of Egypt went through the sea. God made a way through chaos and death. The road out through the sea defeated Pharaoh, created new life for God's people. And Exodus records that a great celebration took place on the other side of the sea. They sang the song of Moses. They danced to the song of Moses. They broke out percussion instruments and moved to the beat of the song of Moses. "I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God, my Father's God. I will praise him. I will exalt him." Then Miriam declared, "We all need to sing this song again. We need this song and the truths of this song to sink more deeply into our souls." And so we read in 15:21, "And Miriam sang to them." And remember from our first sermon in our annual focus on the Exodus way, the word "them" there is masculine and plural. She is leading the entire congregation of Israel in worship. "I will sing unto the Lord," she says. "Let's learn it together. For he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." Can you imagine the joy of that scene? But when the music stopped and God's people looked up, Instead of a land flowing with milk and honey, they saw wilderness. Verse 22. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. At the very moment they were celebrating their deliverance from death at the hand of Pharaoh's army, with Egypt behind them, they see a wilderness in front of them. And the prospect of death at the unyielding hand of deprivation all around them. You see, the road out leads to an unexpected and unwelcomed place. Instead of finding the road into covenant with God, the road into the promised land, they find themselves on the road between. The road between where they were and where they long to be. If the road out takes people out of slavery in Egypt, the road between winds its way through the wilderness. And Exodus portrays the wilderness like this. It's a place with few resources, new enemies, and where the way you've always done things no longer works. Described succinctly, life in the wilderness is life at risk. Can you relate? Perhaps you placed your faith in Jesus Christ. You were saved from sin and death, and the doctor still called and said it's malignant. The memories of abuse won't fade. There's a broken relationship that won't heal. You've been forgiven by God, but your friend refuses to do the same. Maybe you prayed faithfully for your spouse or for the spouse of your child, and your spouse or your son's spouse or your daughter's spouse wasn't faithful to them. You sacrificed for your children, and now they are determined to live, as the parable of the prodigal son says, in the far country. Maybe for the students in the room, you went on the SM retreat last winter or in the summer, and you got home only to have parents who still argue, friends who still betray you, and a coach who still won't play you. My situation last week felt, the last couple of weeks, the last 3 weeks, let's call it, felt a lot like the wilderness. I got a call on the morning of September 25th from my dad at 7 a.m. in the morning. He said, Travis, I have an important funeral that I'm supposed to do, and I can't do it. I said, why can't you do it, Dad? He said, I'm in the hospital. I need you to come do this funeral for me and swing by, and I'll tell you what happened. And so I did, and I went to the hospital, and that's when I learned that my dad had the stroke. And as I was talking to him, I said, Dad, what do you feel right now? He said, I feel like my life changed really fast. Life in the wilderness is life at risk. And yet, you look at chapter 17, verse 1, and you read this. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. God's people find themselves in the wilderness at God's leading. Even as the passage says, according to the commandment of the Lord. Why? Remember, as human beings, we'll do almost anything to avoid pain, discipline, or having to face the deficiencies of our character. But God seems to force us into places and circumstances that make us feel pain, experience discipline, and face the deficiencies of our character. Why? That's my question this morning. Why wilderness? The wilderness is a test. Look at verses 22 through 24 of chapter 15 with me. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. Marah means bitterness. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, "What shall we drink?" See, 3 days in the Bible is a signal that God is administering a test. It's all over the Bible. I'll just give you 3 examples. Genesis 22:4. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. That's when he was tested. Would he offer up his son Isaac or not? And Jonah was in the belly of the fish. How long? 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah 1:17. And Esther 5:1. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. This is the famous scene where she says, "And if I perish, I perish." And when did it happen? On the 3rd day. And what tests in the Bible have in common is life and death are always at stake. The test makes you feel like you are going to die. It takes you to the very boundary between life and death and challenges you to keep moving forward with God. My favorite example of this comes in a passage that we'll be preaching on in a couple of weeks, but I couldn't resist just previewing it for you. It's from Exodus 19. This is about the road in. It says, "Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire." Okay? The mountain is covered in what? It's covered in fire. I just love the imagery here. "And the Lord called to Moses from the top of the mountain, and Moses went up." What is up on top of the mountain? Fire. It's the test. And guess when it happens? On the 3rd day. It looks like if Moses continues to move forward with God, he will be incinerated. And God called Moses to go to the top of the mountain. And what does he do? He went up. Back to Exodus 15. 3 days is both biblical symbolism for the test, and it is actually the literal outer limit that human beings can survive without drinking water. God's people feel literally like they are going to die. They have arrived at the boundary between life and death. The wilderness is a test to see if they will keep moving forward with God, keep walking the road between. Now look at verses 24 and 25 with me again. "And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?' And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and it became sweet." Now, showed him a log, it can work as a translation of this. And I do not like to criticize Bible translators because it's a really hard job, but showed him a log misses the biblical themes that God is trying to get to Moses in this moment. So I guess this is why I have a job. Showed him a log in Hebrew is instructed him about a tree. And that Hebrew word instructed, it's the verb form of the noun Torah. Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, but it's also a Hebrew word that means instruction or teaching. And so God taught Moses, he instructed him, not about a log, but about a tree. Again, Moses here is trying to get you to think biblically. The tree is the same word for the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden. This helps us understand not just what the test looks like or feels like, but what the test is. What is the purpose of the test? The wilderness is a test of trust. Whose wisdom will you trust? That's what the tree was in the garden. Will you trust God's wisdom and God's word, or will you about the tree, or will you trust your wisdom and your word and your desires about the tree? Whose instruction will you trust? God's wisdom? Your wisdom. Culture's wisdom? Your wisdom. The self-help books on the shelves, lining the shelves at Barnes & Noble, or God's wisdom. As I was walking through the wilderness over the past couple of weeks, I bumped into this book. All it takes is a goal. And then the subtitle, the 3-step plan to ditch regret and tap into your massive potential. I thought, so as I'm attempting to feed and care for and find bills and pay bills and deal with issues that I was not even aware of, all I needed was a goal. Oh, man, silly me. Like, why? How did I miss that? Gosh, I should have just had a goal. Wow. God's wisdom or self-help? Think I'm making too much of the phrase instructed him about a tree? Go to the second story. It's the same theme there in chapter 17, verse 6. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. Horeb is another biblical name for Mount Sinai. This second story about water takes place in the region of Sinai. You see, the gift of water and the gift of God's wisdom and the law come from the same place. And the symbolism here is that God's instruction, God's Torah, is as important in life as water. So let me ask you a question for application. These will be great to discuss in our small groups. Where in your life has God led you to the edge of life and death? What would it look like to trust God by continuing to walk the road between in the wilderness? What would it look like to trust God's wisdom instead of your wisdom in your situation? Because the wilderness is a test. And the wilderness is a temptation. Look at our second story, chapter 17, verses 1 and 2. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Remember, the point of our previous story was to teach God's people to trust God's wisdom and instruction during the tests of life. How well did Israel do with this test of trust? They clearly failed the test according to the second story. Instead of submitting to God's test, they decided to test God. They completely invert the way life was designed to work. They ask God to submit to their wisdom to pass their test. And what was the subject of their test? This is fascinating. Verse 7. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? That was their test. is the Lord among us or not? Pain became the test of God's presence. When the water ran out, they assumed God had walked out. They let what they experienced and felt dominate what they believed about God. The wilderness is a temptation to believe God's presence or absence, love or anger is determined by our circumstances. Is the Lord among us or not? It's a stunning question, especially after I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. Now, do you think the Lord is among us or not? They embraced what may be the biggest lie people believe about God. The biggest lie people believe about following Jesus. I'll call it the biggest lie about what the Bible teaches. And that's this, that our circumstances tell the truth about God's character. That's the lie. And it is pervasive. Not just out there in the world, it's pervasive in the Christian community. That our circumstances tell the truth about God's character. Here's what the Bible actually says. Jesus saves us from sin, not from circumstances. Jesus saves us from sin, and then he leads us through our circumstances in ways that form us into his image and likeness. Here's another way to say it. We are not saved from suffering. Rather, salvation transforms how suffering affects us. When you don't believe in Jesus Christ, suffering can destroy you. Why is this happening to me? How do I get through it? My life has changed so radically, I don't even recognize it anymore. But when you have your faith in Jesus Christ, suffering doesn't destroy you, it refines you. This is amazing because I wasn't in any of the worship planning meetings this week. And I already had this quote in my notes. It's an additional verse from the song, How Firm a Foundation, that the choir sang for our offertory. This shows God is the one who plans the worship services. The verse goes like this. When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be my supply. The flame shall not hurt thee. I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. And the results of testing God, they're just disastrous. Look at Numbers chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. God says this, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times. Meribah here, it's just the first of 10 times they succumbed to the temptation to test God. They have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice. None of them shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despised me shall see it. When we succumb to the temptation to test God, God says, you are despising me. Biblical commentator Doug Stewart said this, testing God always involves some degree of doubt about whether or not God could or should have done a better job providing for one's needs. So here's our application question. What wilderness circumstances are tempting you to ask, is the Lord among us or not? And the wilderness tells the truth. The wilderness tells the truth. Go back to verse 23 of our first story in chapter 15. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. If you've been reading through the story up until now, and likely as God's people read this story and wrote this story down, they would have teachers that could make the connections for them. That phrase, they could not drink the water, would leap off the page. It's from Exodus 7:24. It's exactly what was said about the Egyptians during the first plague when the water of the Nile turned to blood. They could not drink the water. Hold that in your minds, and then hear verses 25b and 26. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do that which is right in his eyes and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. God is saying, if you trust me, if you'll walk with me on the road between, I will not treat you like I treated the Egyptians. And there they were wondering, we can't drink this water, just like the Egyptians couldn't drink the water of the Nile. Is God about to treat us like he was going to treat the Egyptians? But God is telling them the truth. He's telling them the truth about life. And this is the truth about life that God is trying to get across. I couldn't say it better than Tim Mackey, who is the chief scholar for something called the Bible Project. My wife actually works for this company. On their podcast, Tim said this: the wilderness tells the truth that the ground of human existence is not ourselves. It comes from someone outside ourselves, which means our existence and every little piece of goodness that sustains my life is just a sheer gift of God. And then I love, it was sort of an after the fact, just a side comment. He goes, this is hard to remember. This is hard to remember. And so God brings them into the wilderness. They could not drink the water, just as the Egyptians could not drink the water. And God says, you're going to have to listen to my commands. Do what I say. Give ear to my statutes. Keep my commandments. There are 4 commands there. Listen, do, give ear, keep. The first one, the word listen, is actually repeated twice. It's listen, which is why in your translation it says diligently listen. The Hebrew is shema, listen. Our entire life, all of it, is completely sustained and wholly dependent on listening to a word that originates with God and not ourselves. The wilderness tells the truth about life, and the wilderness tells the truth about our need for community. Look at verse 27. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. The 12 springs are symbolic to provide water for all 12 tribes of Israel. This is both a reminder of God's complete provision in the wilderness and that part of God's design to provide for us is that he places us in these smaller communities, in these sub-tribes of the nation. This week, I keep saying week, 16 days, whatever it's been, I needed community and I needed it bad. And to be in a community called the Church of Jesus Christ was the greatest gift I could have received in this painful moment for my family. There were doctors from the Chapel family that took my calls at all hours of the day and night. Someone invited me to go see a pickleball match at a tournament. I had never been to a pickleball match. I didn't even know there were pickleball tournaments. It's the only time I had fun. The whole time I was down there. The only time I laughed, the only time I smiled because someone invited me. There was a kid who used to be in student ministries here at the chapel. He now lives about 10 minutes from my parents. I called him. He came over and helped me set up the new downstairs bedroom for my dad when he came home from the hospital. He blew the leaves in my parents' yard and bagged them for me. There's a professor of occupational therapy who teaches at Old Dominion University. He came and inspected my setup and made sure it was safe for my dad to come home. And he sat and spoke with my dad for about 20 minutes and answered all his questions. We need community. I wouldn't have made it without community. If you haven't plugged in to a smaller tribe, I love this church. I always tell people when I teach the membership class, I came to this church as a college student. I love this church before they paid me to love this church. That's my joke I always tell at the membership class. But it is a big church. You need a smaller community where you can sip on the sweet waters that God is providing for you and have people help you in these times of need. If you are not in a small group, please see Dale in the foyer after the service. We would love to get you in a group. Commit to smaller groups of community. And then in those smaller groups of community, be honest about your needs. Because the wilderness tells us the truth about our need for community. And lastly, the wilderness tells us the truth that Jesus Christ is our ultimate hope on the road between. In Matthew 4, we read that Jesus was led by the Spirit where? Into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days, he's on the brink of starvation, and with parched lips, he refuses to succumb to the temptations of the wilderness. He passed the test that we could not pass in the wilderness with no community to help him. All alone, he lived out the truth that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Jesus Christ, our ultimate hope in the wilderness, on the road between, offers us not better circumstances that come from a little water. He offers us the same thing he offered the woman at the well in John 4, living water. He says, whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water dwelling up to eternal life. How can Jesus give us such a gift? On the cross, Jesus cried out, I thirst. Jesus Christ went thirsty in the wilderness so that our eternal thirst for real life could be satisfied, even in the driest wilderness circumstances of life. So why wilderness? The wilderness is a test. It's a test of trust, and you can trust Jesus Christ in your wilderness right now. You can trust him with your whole life for the first time right now. That's what our closing song is going to be about. David in Psalm 23, trusting God in the wilderness spaces of his life. The wilderness is a temptation. It's a temptation to equate our circumstances with God's character. And the wilderness tells the truth. It tells the truth about life, our need for community, and that Jesus Christ, he's our hope in the wilderness.
Thanks for joining us today. Here at the chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. And we hope you'll join us as we walk the Exodus way and learn to trust God on the way out of Egypt, the way between in the wilderness, and the way into his presence.